Thank you very much, Brother Joel, and good evening, brothers and sisters in our Lord Jesus Christ. And it's lovely to be with you here in Halifax Street and to be speaking to you wherever you are, likely in your homes this evening. And we'll come around together and study God's Word, which is always a very, very pleasant thing to do. And I hope you enjoy the thoughts we've got tonight on Russia and the Russian tentacles. Now, brothers and sisters, it's incredible to think that he's been in our world news, for over 20 years. He first occupied the presidency at the start of the millennium, back in the year 2000, and he won his fourth term in a landslide victory in 2018. And in 2024, when he is again scheduled to step down, he'll be aged 71. We are, of course, speaking about Russian President Vladimir Putin. And he's a remarkable man, an absolutely remarkable character. Until he first stood for the presidency, he had never, that is not once, offered himself as a candidate at any election at any political level. So his very, very first election in his entire life was as president of his country. His background, he was the first director of the SFB. Now the FSB is the Federal Security Bureau or Service, the essential successor of the USSR's KGB. So he was a director of the SFB, the successor of the KGB, and then he became, under Yeltsin, the Prime Minister and then acting president when Yeltsin resigned in 1999. And then he won his very first political election, as I said, to become president in March of the year 2000. And since then, every single election that he's had has been a landslide, and his career has been an authoritarian ruler's dream. Now tonight, I'd like to talk to you about Russia, about Mr. Putin, about the tentacles that Mr. Putin and Russia has around this world, and their Bible significance. A few things about Mr. Putin. His Unity Russia party has a majority, which is very pleasant to have, in both the upper and the lower houses of the Federal Assembly. So he can do whatever he wants. He controls the government, he controls the security forces, he controls the armed forces. And the well-known Forbes magazine had him as the world's most powerful person for 4 years in a row. Wherever you go in Russia, there's pictures of him. Public life orbits all around him. And although millions of Russians dislike the harsh and corrupt ways of their rulers, there's also a widespread opinion that the Putin administration has restored a dignity and an authority to the country. His popularity percentage rating remains at a level that most world leaders today would envy. His control goes further than that. He does control the national TV channels. It's no wonder that he can get his message across and influence. He manages all media, so not just national TV, but all media. And if you're a blogger in Russia with more than 3,000 followers, which is not terribly hard to do, then you have to apply for official registration in that country. He's a ruler who believes that his people are lucky to have him as their president. So here's a little extract on the sort of president that he is. The extract says, taken from a book, Kremlin Winter, Putin is a kind of contemporary Tsar. As Russian president, he has extensive formal powers. He appoints, he can dismiss the Prime Minister, the Cabinet, the Chairman of the Central Bank and the highest judges. Not a bad responsibility or portfolio. He can do whatever he wants. Look at this. His rulings settle disputes inside government. He controls foreign policy and approves national military doctrine. He is the Supreme Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, a puissant monarch. So he is in control of everything. The Prime Minister, the Cabinet, the bank, the judges, the judiciary. He settles all the disputes. He is an authoritarian. When we have a look at Russia's recent history, which those of us who are a little older, which I suspect this evening a lot of us will be, we can remember this history which goes back to the mid-80s. We remember Mr. Gorbachev, who was elected as president of the USSR in 1985, and he became the last president of the USSR. It was dissolved in 1991. It was a decision that was made by the Supreme Soviet Council, the most authoritative legislative body in that area in the USSR, and they effectively voted the USSR out of existence. And Mr. Gorbachev then resigned. He was the last president, and Mr. Yeltsin, Boris Yeltsin, became president, but just of Russia. So the USSR dissolved into 15 states, and Mr. Yeltsin became president of Russia. The fleets, the nuclear power, the armaments all got handed over from the USSR to Russia. It became a very great and strong nation. Now, he was president from 1991 until 1999 when he resigned, and he gave his prime minister the acting role as president until Mr. Putin was then formally elected as president in March of the year 2000. And he's been going strong ever since, although we know that in 2008 he, for a political measure, handed over to his prime minister at the time, Medvedev, and made him president under an arrangement that they called the tandem. And he handed over to him for 4 years, from 2008 to 2012, and then they swapped back again, and that's why it's called the tandem. And that allowed for the 2 terms of presidency to start all over again. So that's why Mr. Putin at the moment is coming to the end, or is in his 4th term, because of that tandem arrangement with his Prime Minister. Now, there's been some tough history along the way. If you look at the axis along the bottom of the chart, you'll see some tough things. In 1986, we had the Chernobyl nuclear power plant disaster in Ukraine, which was the result of a flawed reactor design. And the world still knows of this incredible nuclear accident. You'll see all the tanks here at the bottom, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Time after time after time, there's been military invasions and suppressions. In 94 in Chechnya, in 99 again in Chechnya, in 2008 in Georgia, and in 2014 both Crimea and Ukraine. They have invaded or suppressed the other countries, and I'll get to them in a little bit more detail in a minute. In year 2000, you can see there a terrible disaster with the Russian submarine, the Kursk, that had an explosion on board, killing all of its 118 sailors, and is still known today as a terrible disaster and a symbol of the Russian Navy, which has had a lot of problems with its submarines. Maybe on a happier side, in the year 2014, Russia hosted in Sochi the Winter Olympic Games. In 2018, they hosted the FIFA Football World Cup, or soccer as we would know it. And while they weren't without their problems and their challenges and people parading at the time and making statements, they were generally very well run and good for Russian PR. That's a little bit of the history. It's been a checkered one. It's been tough, with a significant military role in there and presence. And you can see the presidents there with Mr. Gorbachev and then Mr. Yeltsin and then Mr. Putin and then Mr. Medvedev handing back to Mr. Putin after that. With the dissolution of the USSR, the Republic became 15 different countries. And there they are listed in English, of course, for tonight in alphabetical order. starting at Armenia all the way through to Ukraine and Uzbekistan. If we look at a map of exactly the same area and the same 15 countries, you can see that massive area of Russia in the middle. They took the bulk of it. They took the fleet, the navy, the nuclear arms, and of course, Moscow. But all around that area to the west and to the south are the 14 other smaller, in some cases much smaller countries that have been spawned by the dissolution of that republic. Now that's a significant thing for us today. And it's a significant thing for Mr. Putin because he's unhappy about that. He's not happy. On the slide you'll see he's not nostalgic about communism, but he's bitter about that breakup of the USSR, which in April 2005 he described as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And he said, "I'd like to repeat my argument that the Russian people became the biggest divided people in the world, and this is an absolute tragedy." Now, this tells us a lot about Mr. Putin. They were regarded for a long time as perennial losers. They suffered, they struggled. The economy and the armed forces were in tatters. They found themselves dispossessed of 14 republics in the former Soviet Union and just Russia in the end. And we in the West struggle to understand that. But here, Mr. Putin, he's not bitter about communism, but he's bitter about the breakup. He misses those 15 countries. He misses their bulk. And he says there that that breakup was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Now we say, seriously? The greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Now think about what he's missed there. He's missed World War I. That was pretty big. He's missed World War II. He's missed Hitler's rise to power and the Holocaust and the death of millions. He's missed the Chinese Revolution. He's got all of them to pick from, and yet Mr. Putin says that the breakup of the USSR was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 1900s. Well, it wasn't. But that tells us, brothers and sisters, how this man thinks. His heart is in the USSR. His heart are in those 15 countries, and he desperately wants them back. So what he did then was he started a series of invasions to restore its former glory. There we have the same map that we looked at a minute ago. And in 1999, there was the second, this one was a suppression, a second war in Chechnya. So it had first been invaded and taken over in 1994, and then they went back in 1999 to suppress an uprising from Chechnya in that year. That's the first. And then in 2008, Georgia was invaded and partially occupied. Some of it still occupied by Russia today for convenience. In 2014, Crimea was annexed, and an annexation is when you just forcibly take it over. Russia moved in and said, "You are now ours." Crimea is now Russia. They just took it over. And they didn't really suffer because of that. Their international public relations weren't incredibly damaged. But you can just imagine if as an example, Australia just took over New Zealand tomorrow, the world would be in uproar. Our relations would be terrible. We'd never be forgiven, and yet Russia has just taken over Crimea and said, "You are now ours." That's what they've done. In 2014, they also invaded Ukraine, and there are still Russian soldiers in Ukraine today. So there's a little bit of background to Russia and the politics of that area and some of the geopolitical history of it in the last 20 or 25 years. I want to talk to you about its finances. When Mr. Putin came to the scene, the economy had been in a very deep recession since the late 1980s. Things were really tough. There was a surge in oil and gas prices, though, that allowed payment of that debt. So when Mr. Putin came to power in 2000, the year 2000, there was a rise in revenues from oil and gas that massively benefited the economy. So what that means is that Mr. Putin, while he has been president, has had very good revenues from the sale of commodities like oil. By 2017, have a look at this for a turnaround, the national debt had reduced from 92% of GDP to less than 12%. Now, what does that mean? Well, let's compare it to the US, which has at the same time 82% debt, and Australia 47% of its GDP. In 2017, Russia was down to 12. So it had paid off its debts, all its foreign debt obligations had been paid off, and it had significantly forgiven ex-Soviet republic debt, and a lot of that had been to Ukraine. So not debt-free, but in a very, very good position. Interestingly, in 2017, that same year, Mr. Putin claimed a modest salary of $150,000 and to possess a 77 square metre apartment, a 1,500 square metre block of land, a garage and 3 cars of Russian manufacturer. You can imagine putting that in at the end of the year income statement, can't you? We understand that he was worth a lot more than that. In fact, some estimates put his real assets in the order of $40 to $50 billion. So he claimed a very modest existence, but he is a very, very wealthy man. Now let's have a look at that change in Russian finances and their national economy. Here's a graph of crude oil price measured in US dollars per barrel. It's using the WTI index, which is one of 2 very broad and popular indexes to measure this. Notice how it's not adjusted for CPI. From the period up to when Mr. Putin came into power in the year 2000, you could see the price of oil, crude oil, per barrel oscillating at around about the $20 per barrel. In 2000, it had a small spike. It went up to, let's say, $25 to $30 a barrel for 4 or 5 years, and then it continued to go up and up and up and up. It spiked. It peaked at $140 per barrel. That's all money for jam. So things weren't good at $20 a barrel. They existed, but things weren't good. As soon as you get a bit higher than that and higher, and you get up over $100, this is just money for jam. They're just raking this money in, and that's why they could repay all of that debt. It's a little bit like the case of iron ore in Australia, how for a long time we were able to just dig it up, extract it from the ground, put it on a boat and send it overseas. And then the GFC brought iron ore price per tonne down from about $150 to maybe $50 or $40, and you have to get smarter as to how you manufacture and ship it out. But at $100 a barrel for crude oil, Russia was saying, bring it on, this is magnificent, we love it, and they're paying down their debt. Now have a look here. That's where Mr. Putin comes to power. Things were tough. All they had were potatoes for decades. And he comes to power and the economy starts to do very, very well. What happened here, the GFC? Things hit rock bottom again, back down to a bit over $40. Not terrible, but a whole lot less than $140 that it had peaked up. And then it starts to reverse again, goes up and up and up until here we have fracking. The introduction of fracking where oil is obtained through rock and there is a subsequent oversupply of oil and a glut. And in that process, the United States changed from being a net importer of oil to an exporter. And oil-producing companies like Russia found that very hard. So it's back down again. It's sort of round about the $50 a barrel. But you can see that the the trends there and the histories and the prosperity of Russia in the last 30, 40, 50 years has been directly related to the price of oil. And Mr. Putin has had a very, very cushy period. He hasn't had to worry about finances too much. He hasn't had to optimise things. He hasn't had to have significant reforms. He just needs to keep pumping out the oil. And that's why we had cartoons like that Mr. Putin is all muscle, and it's oil muscle, and it's Gazprom muscle. And that's where he gets his life from. Okay, that's finances. What about their military? Well, they've increased their military spend from 3.6% of GDP in 2000 to 4.2% in 2013 and 4.5% in 2017. And you might say, well, they're just little increases, but that's a 50% increase, nearly, and it's of GDP, so the total spend is going up, of course. By the end of 2016, all NCOs, non-commissioned officers in the Russian army, were professional recruits with uni degrees rather than ex-conscripts. So there's now a quote in the Russian military that quantity gives way to quality. They want the best people, and they want the best people in their military forces. So there's their finances, there's their military, and there's their leader, Mr. Putin. Let's have a look at some of their links with the world. The most critical one is with Ukraine. We know that Russia invaded Crimea in February in 2014, and for Vladimir Putin it was axiomatic that Russians and Ukrainians share a single national identity. That's a big statement, isn't it? Russians and Ukrainians share a single national identity. His is a mindset that is centuries old. And Russian commanders saw that the Sevastopol naval base in Crimea as crucial for Russia's security. And we'll have a look at a map of that in a few minutes. Many ordinary Russians, so this is not just Mr. Putin, many ordinary Russians felt that Russia and Ukraine ought to stick together. So there's a relationship there, Russia and Ukraine, that's important. And he didn't do it terribly delicately or discreetly. He just walked into Ukraine, into Crimea, and kicked the door in and said, I'm coming in, and in Mr. Putin came. Now, the question we ask, why does Mr. Putin want Ukraine? Well, he wants all ex-USSR countries back, really, all 14 of them, to make a combined area. But there's a little bit more here. He wants to keep them away from NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation. But further than that, and most importantly, the answer is that the heartland of ancient Rus was Ukraine. So this is important. You can see there on the map there's Ukraine. To the northeast of Ukraine is Russia. And Russia, Mr. Putin, so Mr. Putin is president of just Russia, one of the 15 of the original USSR. Russia wants Ukraine back in its fold because the heartland of ancient Rus was Ukraine. Now, what do we know about this? Well, there are deep cultural links between these two countries. This is important. The Russian Orthodox Church draws on a heritage founded in Kiev in the 9th century. So the heritage, the history of the whole Russian Orthodox Church was founded in Kiev. Before the First World War, the Ukrainian lands were shown on Tsarist maps as provinces of the Russian Empire, and the region was called Malorussia, or Little Russia. Putin maintained that Ukraine was of artificial political construct. He says, I make no distinction between Ukrainians and Russians. I think we are one people, he said. Another quote, which is important, Mr. Putin has favoured the Russian Orthodox Church which has abided rigidly to its centuries-old liturgy and doctrines, to the greater degree than even the Roman Catholic Church, Orthodox leaders see no point in modernising. As a result, its patriarch and hierarchy strongly support the Kremlin's conservative social policies. Belief in God is officially endorsed for its help in cementing Russian statehood. And Patriarch Kirill, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, was the first dignitary that Mr. Putin greeted after his 2018 inauguration ceremony. And there they are, Mr. Putin and Patriarch Kirill, very close and working together, one as the head of a nation and the other as the head of a church. Now, Mr. Putin has identified with the church, with the Orthodox Christian faith. And sometimes he fumbles his words in church, and so people are sometimes a little bit sceptical about how regular he is, but he tells people his identification with the Orthodox faith. His mother had him baptised in Leningrad in defiance of communist policy. So as a boy, he was baptised into the Orthodox Christian faith. And what he found out years later is that the priest who baptised him was the father of the man on the screen. He was the father of Russian Orthodox Church leader, Patriarch Kirill. So Mr. Putin was baptised by this man's father. Now, why is all this important? Why are we talking about Russia? Why are we talking about Ukraine? Why are we talking about this area? Well, what we find is in Ezekiel 38, which Joel read for us tonight, we have a reference to this exact area in the prophet's words in verses 1 and 2. So if you've got your Bible still there, still open in Ezekiel 38, we'll read verses 1 and 2. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, set your face towards Gog of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him. So what we have there is some parties. Son of man, so this is a title of Ezekiel himself, as a type of our dear Lord Jesus Christ. Son of man, set your face towards, and here they are, Gog. So Gog is a title. It's someone who comes from the land of Magog. Set your face against this being, this person, this entity, Gog, who comes from the land of Magog, and he is the chief prince, or as we know it, as my margin has it, the Prince of Rosh, the chief prince, the Prince of Rosh, and of Meshech, and of Tubal, and I want you to prophesy against them. So this is the importance of that verse, that Gog, this leader of the Northern Confederacy in the latter days, came from the land of Magog. Now, where's the land of Magog? Well, it's very difficult on the screen. We quote there to conclude what is the land of Magog, or Syria today. But based on ancient historians such as Herodotus, the locality of Magog is generally around the areas of Ukraine and Moldova and Romania, and then it stretches up a bit, most probably into Belarus to the north and southern Poland, and possibly including some of Hungary and the Czech and Slovak republics. So if we were to draw that, that's where Ukraine is. That's where the land of Magog is. That's where Gog comes from. So that's what Ezekiel 38 tells us, that this entity, this Northern Confederacy, right at the end of time, will come from the land of Magog, which is essentially Ukraine. And that's why Russia, right next door to the northeast, wants it back. They want to work together. At the moment, there's separate countries with separate agendas and separate directions. Mr. Putin wants them back. And that's why he's invaded, and that's why he's desperate to have them on his agenda. Gog of the land of Magog. And then we read in verse 2 of Ezekiel 38 that he was the chief prince, or the prince of Rosh, as it should be. And we know this quote well, I suspect, from Gesenius on the screen, the prince of Rosh. Rosh was a northern nation mentioned with Tubal and Meshech in Ezekiel 38 there. Undoubtedly the Russians, says Gesenius, who are mentioned by Byzantine writers of the 10th century under the name of Oipus, dwelling to the north to Taurus, and described by this writer, an Arabic writer of the same age, as dwelling on the river Wa. So Rus there, or Rosh, in Ezekiel 38 verse 2, is undoubtedly the Russians. So that puts us in a new set, doesn't it, in Ezekiel 38 verse 2. Son of man, Ezekiel, set your face towards the leader, Gog, this title of this one at the front, of the land of Magog, from Ukraine, effectively, and the prince of Russia, and Meshech of Moscow, and Tubal of Tubalsky, and prophesy against them. Get this group together and make a confederacy from them, says Ezekiel. And this is where Russia is today. This is why we're so interested in Mr. Putin. This is why we're so interested in the agendas that he has among the nations. And this is why we are so interested in him wanting Ukraine back. Because Ukraine is Magog, and he desperately wants that country back. He has an agenda to bring back all of the countries under the great auspices of the united Russia. And then Ezekiel says in verse 3, thus says the Lord God, behold, I'm against you, O Gog, there it is again, prince of Rosh and Meshech and Tubal, and I'll turn you about and put hooks into your jaws, and I'll bring you out, all of your army and your horses and your horsemen, all of them clothed in full armour, a great host. See how big it is. A great host. All of them with buckler and shield, wielding swords, Persia and Cush and Putta with them, all of them with shield and with helmet. So he desperately wants that area back. This is why it's important, brothers and sisters. What else do we know about this area? Well, Kievan Rus was a loose federation of East Slavic and Finnic people in Europe from the late 9th to the mid-13th century. The modern nations of Belarus, Russia and Ukraine all claim Kievan Rus as their cultural ancestors. And Kievan comes from Kiev, which is the capital of Ukraine, Rus's first capital. So that's the interest. That's what Mr. Putin has. This is his agenda, that he wants Russia and he wants the Ukraine back together. This was the origins of the church. This is the origins of the people. Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, was the ancestry, the history of all of these modern nations. And Mr. Putin wants them back, exactly as Ezekiel chapter 38 said would happen. I just want to talk to you a little bit more about some broader Russian politics. Here's a photo of Mr. Putin and Ukrainian President Zelensky, who met earlier this year with French Mr. Macron for the very first time that they came together at a summit in Paris to find a way to end the 5 years of fighting in East Ukraine. Mr. Macron is an interesting advocate of some things against NATO. And Mr. Macron says the French president has warned Europe that it can no longer rely on America to defend NATO allies. What we are currently experiencing is the brain death of NATO, he says. Europe stands on the edge of a precipice and needs to start thinking of itself strategically as a geopolitical power, otherwise we will no longer be in control of our destiny. So Mr. Macron says we can't rely on the US. We can't rely on a dead NATO. Europe needs to come together and do it itself. Who is NATO's enemy, he says? Russia's no longer an enemy. It remains a threat, but it is also a partner on some subjects. This is the French president. Our enemy today is international terrorism, and in particular Islamist terrorism. So the links with Russia and NATO are clear. The links with Russia and Ukraine are clear. Let's use it a little bit further away. We're not going to dwell on Brexit too much. We want to talk about Russia tonight. But we remember this history when David Cameron quits after the vote for Britain to break with Europe. And Mr Johnson, of course, is in power at the moment. This is one of his quotes from last year before the Brexit vote went through, or before they won that majority in Parliament in December, when he says, "I have a frustration about how the most important project in our lifetime has been going." He says, "This is the biggest thing in my entire lifetime, this Brexit thing." Now, what's Russia thinking about this? Well, the European Union, this quote says, was breaking up, or at least one of its leading states, i.e. Britain, was choosing to split away. Russian leaders had tried for years to produce divisions in Europe, but never in their wildest dreams had they imagined such a result. So without laughing out loud, Mr. Putin could not have shown greater delight. The Russians are ecstatic about the breakup of the EU that happened when Britain has left, and Britain leaving that scene. They love this. This is magnificent for them. And of course, at the end of last year, there was a vote in Britain and a change in the results and the number of seats. And we know that Mr Johnson did exceedingly well through that. It was an amazing election outcome, a dramatic. Mr Johnson won 365 seats. That's an increase of 66. And now he has a majority of 80. A majority of 80 in Parliament, which means he could and he has passed Brexit legislation. The opposing Labor Party won just 203. It was their worst result since 1935. An incredible turnaround, which means that Mr Johnson now has a cube that's all worked out and he can do whatever he wants. And, as Joel read for us, the British lion is roaring. So that takes us back to Ezekiel chapter 38, doesn't it? Where we read at the end that there was the lions of Tarshish, the leaders there, the lions and Sheba and Dedan, who were going to come up from the south and say, "Hey, have you come to take a spoil? The British lion is roaring." But we want to talk about Russia and Brexit. So here's a quote. As British Remainer politicians, those that wanted to remain in the EU, as British Remainer politicians sought to explain their defeat, evidence emerged that Russian internet companies had disseminated propaganda in favour of the Leave cause. Remember, Russia wanted them to leave. And there was well-grounded speculation that the Kremlin had sponsored these efforts, and that Russians had also supplied financial support for the British pro-Leave organisations. Wow. And though nobody could fairly conclude that the referendum result was entirely the product of Russian machinations, a degree of influence from Russia was hard to deny. So the Russians were linked and to a degree articulated Britain's exit from the EU. Further to that, it later transpired that Russian companies employed devious methods to use Facebook data to discover the identity of voters hostile to the EU and then target them with fake news designed to stiffen their will to vote Leave. Incredible politics, but that's what they do and that's what they do best. Russian companies, do we think that they did that by themselves? That they woke up one morning and thought, let's have a go at Great Britain? Or do we think that that direction came from further up? There's no doubt that the Russians were supportive and somewhat articulated this exit from the EU that Britain had at the end of last year and the beginning of this year. So the Russian tentacles are in Ukraine, in France, in Europe, and in Britain. And Russia's pretty happy. They love that. They love the breakdown of Great Britain. I just want to quote here from Dr. Thomas in his work, The Exposition of Daniel. The premises now before us also establish the position that as Nebuchadnezzar's image is representative of the Gogian Empire in full manifestation, long words I know, but it makes sense, it is impossible in the nature of things that Britain can be within the 10 toes. Now, brothers and sisters, this book was written in 1868. Dr. Thomas knew through the inspired word that this had to be the case. And we've seen that in 2016 and chiefly last year and this year that Britain has come out of that EU. Now let's just move down to the Middle East. And we want to have a little look at Russia in Syria. So ISIS and a civil war was a catalyst for Russia's entry in 2015. So ISIS served its purpose. It got Russia into Syria. Simple as that, full stop. What was ISIS all about? ISIS got Russia into Syria. ISIS was a part of fulfilling Ezekiel 38 and Daniel chapter 11. That's what ISIS did. The Russian Air Force began bombing rebel-held Syrian cities in February 2015. And Putin, in his confidence, assumed that the risks were pretty minimal. They could bomb these areas, and it had never been easier for Russian armed forces to make an impact in the Middle East. Beautiful. You couldn't design it better, could you? Russia got invited into Syria, invited into the Middle East. Come and help us. And they did, and they bombed, and they were thanked for it. They lease Syria's Tartus port for 49 years. With 25-year extensions on top of that. So they have a lease of that port, the Tartus port in the Mediterranean, and Mr. Trump helped them by withdrawing. And then we have an image there, a great cartoon of him even wrapping it and with a magnificent bow there, and say, here we are, Mr. Putin, Syria's all yours. And Mr. Putin said, thank you. Now, this is important for Russia. Putin has also aimed to leave the United States out of the region and regain for Russia the presence and the influence that the USSR had once enjoyed. And his actions in Syria were part of his effort to confirm his country's status as a great power. He's not playing games. He's not just off to have a little bit of a weekend joyride. He's here to re-establish the greatness of his country in the world scene, how great Russia is. So he's in the Middle East. Remember what we said about the port of Tartus? He plans to invest $500,000 in that port. It'll be the largest investment that they have in Syria. It'll leverage his position as the most powerful foreign player in the area, and it will be their sole naval base outside of the former Soviet Union. And now Mr. Putin's got a spot in the Mediterranean. Here's a map of Mr. Putin's southern ports. You'll notice the one at the top there, Novorossiysk on the Black Sea. It's part of Russia. It's the Russian original Black Sea port. And then in their invasion of Crimea, in the bottom of Ukraine there, they took Sevastopol. Now, Sevastopol was a very important regional capital and Black Sea port, and they took it. And now they've got two, thank you very much. But now, down the bottom, they've got Tartus. They've got three in this southern area. So they're not linked, they're not constrained to the Black Sea. They don't have to worry about getting their boats through Istanbul and through Turkey and all of those issues that go with it. Now they've got boats in the Mediterranean that can go to Tartus. Exactly, I think, how Ezekiel would have thought it would pan out. And here's some great quotes from the New York Times in October last year. In Syria, Russia is pleased to fill an American void. Defense Secretary Mark Esper said Sunday that President Trump ordered a withdrawal of American forces from northern Syria. a decision that will effectively cede control of that area to the Syrian government and Russia, and could allow a resurgence of the Islamic State. And as the United States withdraws from Syria, Russia is happily stepping in. It's all working out. The US is gone, and there they are with their trucks departing. Mr. Trump's quoted there as saying, "It's time for us to get out and let others, such as Russia and Iran, figure the situation out," said The Economist last October. Incredible news. Incredible things. These people can't have read Ezekiel 38, but it's being lived out in our days, and this is the excitement that we can share. And so we won't go there because we've already read Ezekiel 38 verse 5 about Persia having been part of this northern confederacy. Daniel 11 talks about a king of the north and a king of the south. The king of the north was the Seleucids, we know, and they ruled over Syria and Iran. And so that northern king had to have links with Syria and Iran before it could come down. And we've just seen, haven't we, just in those few slides, that close link between Russia as it's linking with Syria and linking with Iran. Let's talk about Iran. American sanctions have caused financial crisis in Iran. It's in a very difficult place. Russia has taken a lot of money in oil and gas away from the area. General Soleimani was dead. He was killed by the Americans last year, the second most powerful man. And the president has lost the confidence of the people. Iran is in a very, very difficult bind at the moment. It's struggling. But Russia's moving in. And it's made a number of plans with Iran. Firstly, to use Iran's ports of Bandar, Ibushar and Chabahar as forward military bases for warships and nuclear submarines. So Russia's coming into Iran and it wants to use those two ports for military bases for its warships and nuclear submarines. So here's a graphic of where they are. And if you can make it out on the graphic, the two yellow circles there are Bandar and Chabahar. Bandar on the Straits of Hormuz there, one of the most critical and most important oil transit choke points. In fact, I've read that 35% of all seaborne oil passes through that strait. That's over a third. A third of the world's seaborne oil goes through that strait. And Russia's going to have warships and nuclear submarines right at that point. Incredible. And also at Chabahar, at the entry there of the Gulf of Oman into the Arabian Sea. So that's what Russia's done in its ties with the Iranian government. And there's a number of things there that Mr. Putin has arranged. He's going to give them $50 billion per year, every year, for at least 5 years, so he could complete top priority oil projects. That's $250 billion, and then a further $250 billion would be available for the following 5 years. So Mr. Putin is buying his way in. Iran's agreed to buy Russian missile defense system, which is incredible, and Russia will be there in Syria and Iran. Now, I reckon we've seen images like that on our lecture screens for decades, but this one came from The Express in August last year. And it's talking about a Middle East Cold War. And it says that the analysis suggests that Iran will be backed up by Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Iraq and Iran, while the US primary ally would be Saudi Arabia, who would be likely supported by Israel, Bahrain, Jordan and the UAE. And you can make it out there in the green colours with Iran's sphere of influence and the red with the US. These are exactly the nations that we're talking about in Ezekiel 38. It's exactly the confederacies that we see, and it's the exact influence that Russia is having on the Middle East as it has through Europe. Incredible. What an incredible map that is. Russia is king of the Middle East. I'm not going to dwell on this one. He's getting very close with Turkey. He's changed, hasn't he, from being an opponent to a supplicant. We can just remember it was only a few years ago that Mr. Erdogan shot down a Russian jet, military jet, over Turkish airspace, and they hated each other, and now they're best friends, or at least Mr. Erdogan is a supplicant of Mr. Putin. And Russia and Israel, well, that's an interesting relationship. Mr. Putin wants to preserve his good relations. He admires, he respects Benjamin Netanyahu. They're great figures, great men, great brains, great politicians. And so there's some respect there. But we know in Ezekiel 38, as Joel read for us, that Russia's going to come down and invade that country. And why would they do that? Well, would it be in response to a massive disruption to regional peace? Will it be that the Middle East just falls apart and regional peace is gone and Russia has to come down, or wants to come down, or decides to come down to help out? Or will it be with Russian economic difficulties? Russia only has two commodities that are exports. One is hydrocarbons, or oil, if we can call that a commodity, and the other is armaments. That's the only things they export. Everything else, maybe they export a little bit of agricultural produce as well, but we don't sit down and eat Russian cheese or beef, do we? It's not known for that. It's known for its hydrocarbon, its oil, and it's known for its arms. That's what they do. And if the bottom falls out of those markets, they're in a tough way. And what's oil doing at the moment? How much is petrol? How much has petrol been in Australia in the last month? That's when Russia starts to get really, really difficult. So we don't know why, but in Ezekiel 38, that northern confederacy, which now has its links in Iran and Syria, and was invited into those areas, and has a Mediterranean port, is going to come down and invade Israel. And I think we're in Ezekiel 38 right now. We live in incredible times, brothers and sisters. There's Russia there in that big red area on the top right of the screen. And they've moved into Ukraine and Crimea and Georgia and Chechnya. And they have aspirations for the rest of those 14 countries. And they've moved politically into Europe, into Western Europe. Mr. Macron from France now no longer views Russia as an enemy. He's worried about the US instead of all of the things. And the top left, Britain, has left Europe. They said, we don't want to do anything. And so there's a divide. Britain's gone. They're over there. They're an island power, exactly as Ezekiel 38 said, with all of its merchants. We read that. Joel read that for us. The merchants of Tarshish, the seafaring nations, the lions, the young lions. That's where she is. And over here on the east is Russia and Ukraine, the land of Magog, Gog of the land of Magog, and all of Europe, Western and Eastern Europe, and they're starting to talk. But not just Europe. To the south, Russia's come down into Syria. Please come down and help us, and they did. And they're in Iran, and friends with Turkey. So we can see that the whole Black Sea area there is pretty much Russian now. And Russia has ports, not just 2 ports in the Black Sea, but in Tartus in the Mediterranean as well. And nuclear submarines planned for the Straits of Hormuz. That's Ezekiel 38. And that's where we are today. Son of man, set your face against this northern confederacy and get them together and pull them down, and we're going to have a big war. And we know about that, and Christ is going to interrupt that war. I just want to close on what Russia's doing right now. We recall that in January this year, the entire government resigned. They were told to resign, but the entire government resigned. Mikhail Mishustin is the new Prime Minister of Russia, and he was invited to, and he did form a new government. He's very capable, he's serious and thorough and does his stuff, but he's no challenge to the president, and that's the way Mr. Putin likes it. There's been suggested constitutional changes to increase the role of Parliament. So we want a bit more Parliament, but we don't want too much. At the same time, what they noted that Russia would not remain stable under a parliamentary system. So we can't go to democracy, we can't go to the West, but we can make some tokenistic changes to that end. Mr. Putin suggests that he will step down in 2024. That's what he's said. He's suggested that. The constitutional changes also say that future presidents will be limited to 2 terms, and so that could give Mr. Putin another 12 years. And so the changes have gone out, and in fact the new constitution, the amended constitution, was going to be voted on the 22nd of April. So that's just a couple of weeks ago. But it was deferred, it was postponed because of coronavirus. And so we yet to get to that vote. But one of the constitutional amendments would have allowed Mr. Putin to run again for 2 more 6-year presidential terms, something that he hasn't yet ruled out. In which case, if he had a further 12 years after 2024, then people are saying effectively he's plotting to stay in power for life, while supporters have lauded the inclusion of the amendment and said, yeah, greatest thing. Some think he'll become a chairman to focus on running the world while his aides focus on Russia. The outcome is inevitable. He's going to be a strong man, and Gog is going to be strong. And Ezekiel 38 is going to be put in place brick by brick. What's happening in the world? Well, China's been quietened. They were getting strong, they were getting rowdy, they were getting very powerful. Coronavirus has changed that. They've been pushed back. They're not a player in Bible prophecy, as we know. There might be one small reference to them in the prophets, but they're not a player in Bible prophecy, and they've been quietened. The US, though, has become very weak, and we'll see what happens about that in the next year or two if we're still here. There's a huge number of coronavirus cases in the US. In fact, there's 5 times as many as in the second country of Spain. And the US now has 66,000 deaths. No other country has more than 30,000. The US has been incredibly hit. As a comparison, you'll know that Australia has, last I read, 93 deaths. The US has 66,000. So it's really been hit as a country and its economy, and the US economic contraction is huge, and the central bank is right now pumping trillions of dollars into the economy and money that it doesn't have, and that's just more debt. Russia has a coronavirus problem too. They had yesterday, the 2nd of May, nearly 10,000 new COVID-19 cases. And as you probably know, their Prime Minister, Mikhail Mishustin, has coronavirus right now and has self-isolated. So that's what we're doing at the moment. Let's think about Mr. Putin. He's a strong man. He's an articulate leader. He's on a mission. He wants to get the Soviets back together. He wasn't nostalgic about the breakup of communism, but he regrets and he's bitter about the breakup of the Soviet states. And there's a quote of him speaking to foreign guests in October in 2015, and he confided, here's something I'd like to say. 50 years ago, I learned one rule on the streets of Leningrad. If a fight's inevitable, be the first to attack. And that's what he does. He went into Chechnya, not once, but twice. He's been into Georgia, into Crimea, into Ukraine. If a fight is inevitable, be the first to attack. And he will, because Ezekiel said he would. And I just want to close, brothers and sisters, with this quote from a book that we know well, the preface of Elpis Israel. This book was written in 1849. That's 171 years ago. We need to think about that. This book, I suspect, is one that some of us would have read, not all of us. It's probably in a lot of our libraries. It's probably been given as a gift to many of us when we were baptized. This book was written over 170 years ago, and this is what it said. The future movements of Russia are notable signs of the times because they are predicted in the scriptures of truth. when Russia makes its grand move for the building up of its empire, then let the reader know that the end of all things, as at present constituted, said Dr. Thomas, is at hand. The long-expected but stealthy advent of the King of Israel will be on the eve of becoming a fact, and salvation will be to those who believe the gospel of the kingdom of God. Brothers and sisters, we believe these things. We've been reading Ezekiel 38 for years, some of us for decades, perhaps a few of you for, for 50 years. We believe this. Brother Thomas wrote that 170 years ago. And he was able to write that, not because he was inspired, because he understood the scriptures and he believed Ezekiel, the things that were written by the Son of Man. I so believe, brothers and sisters, that these things must be pointing forward to the fulfillment of that chapter. And I think we should all be galvanized to think about God and to pray for the return of his Son, because it's an absolute certainty. Thank you.